the new normal. So the plan for today is we're going to have a welcome from our colleagues at the USDA Ag Marketing Service, who are our primary funders, our sole funders for this initiative. We're now in the second iteration. And then I'm going to introduce our panelists and the topic, and then we're going to have a really open dialogue across our panelists, sharing their expertise and experiences, and trying to identify those cross-sectoral emergent properties of the work that we're doing in local food systems. So I will invite Christina Connell to say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to be here today. I know this has been kind of a rough start to the new year for many of us, so really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today and have this conversation with us. I just wanted to reiterate kind of how important and how excited we at USDA AMS are about this project. We've been really excited about the opportunity to connect directly with local and regional food system stakeholders. It has informed our policymaking and funding decisions over the last year, and will continue to do that. And more importantly, for this webinar series in particular, we're excited to have folks directly from communities that have been impacted by COVID. Of course, everyone has, but so we can hear from those stories directly and think about how we might learn from them and think about how we can adapt those strategies in the future to other organizations or other localities. So just want to say that this project and this webinar series is a really important way for us at USDA to kind of have a pulse of what's going on the ground. We can understand what's going on out there, and that they have, of course, implications across communities, but hopefully at the national level as well. So again, we really just value your time for being here and giving folks the attention, and I'm really excited to hear from our speakers today. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Christina. So you heard about our project in the video. I'm going to do a brief recap and then head in. So there are three main components of a second iteration of this project. We're calling them action teams and areas of work. So first is our network of networks. That is not, there we go. We'll provide more information about this in the future, but we're convening network leaders to look at how we support each other moving forward in future disruptions, and to do that cross-sectoral sharing across university researchers, USDA partners, and our community of practice leaders. We have a data and metrics team that you'll hear from in our March webinar. So each of our teams is putting forward a webinar to share the work we're doing and sort of that ongoing conversation. They're working on a robust local and regional food systems data dashboard so that we can increase the accessibility and actionability, like make data work for local and regional food systems, and do that community of practice of sharing innovations and helping each other along that path. And today's webinar is coming out of our resilience playbook team, where we're looking at how can we learn from the lessons of 2020 with the pandemic and simultaneous natural disasters and social crises to identify the strengths and weaknesses of local regional food systems and develop short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies for fostering equitable resilience. And from this, we are developing a number of resources that you'll have access to via our web hub and other activities. We're building this network together so we can continue this conversation and sharing. We'll have a number of web-based resources, the data platform, the resilience playbook that I'll have access to, as well as the continuation of the resource hub developed in 1.0, toolkits, publications, case studies for y'all to work with, and this draft strategy in the resilience playbook. All that to say, the question that the resilience playbook team is asking is, how do we codify the lessons of 2020, 2021, 2022? How do we keep this learning into a set of strategies, resources, networks, and knowledge that support local and regional food systems in preparing for and navigating the next disruption? It's not if, it's a question of like when it's coming. And while also addressing the underlying vulnerabilities and inequalities that inhibit equity across our food system. So not just resilience for the sake of pulling yourself up every time you get knocked down, but how do we ensure that all of our community members, all the stakeholders across local and regional food systems are prepared and connected so that we can care for and support each other. We're doing this is just a sneak peek to tease for those of you that like charts and heat maps. We are looking at the products developed through the pandemic that were generated by our local regional food system partners and saying, where were there's a lot of activity and resources, where were they scarce, what were those resources about? I'm not going to, this is just to tease you that there's more to come in our analysis and also these ongoing conversations. So that brings us to today's webinar, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to go on the list that I have them on here. So today's conversation is asking, what is that new normal? Where are we now? How do we take stock? What lessons are we carrying forward? And how are we thinking about equitable resilience moving into a new era? So we have with us Summer Sibley Brown from the Virgin Island Good Food Coalition. She is a local food systems development advocate and the founder and executive director of the Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition. Her organization seeks to raise awareness about the importance and impact of healthy local food systems in that territory. She's also the creator of Food Learn, a program that exposes youth in the community to food system conversations and encourages soft skill development like networking and public speaking. Her vision is to aid the revitalization of agriculture in the Virgin Islands and unite local food producers, local businesses, and local consumers to create sustainable network of local food operations. We also have with us Sarah Elliott. Sarah brings more than 15 years of experience working in food system development from different entry points across different sectors in a wide variety of scales. Prior to co-founding SIFT Consulting, she served 5 years as the manager of the Dane County Farmers Market, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, for those of y'all that don't know, the largest producer-only farmers market in the nation. She navigated the market through the pandemic, including pivoting operations to pre-order and drive-through, resulting in more than $1.5 million in sales. Currently, in addition to helping nonprofits build and grow strong local food systems through her consulting work, she is also the network engagement manager for the Artisan Grain Collaborative, a very cool Midwestern non-commodity grains group. We have Roberto Mesa with us. Roberto is a first-generation farmer, artist, and local food advocate. He was born in Mexico City and immigrated to the US when he was 4 years old. He started farming in 2012 after experiencing some personal health struggles while a grad student at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Roberto is the co-founder of Emerald Gardens, a year-round greenhouse farm in Bennett, Colorado, and CEO of East Denver Food Hub, a local food supplier based in Denver. His work lies at the intersection of policy, agriculture, sustainable technology, food systems, and environmental stewardship. He is a member of the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council, vice president of the board of the National Young Farmers Coalition, and is a member of the Colorado Agriculture Commission. And finally, Stuart Rhee. He's a co-op trajectory launched in 1976 when he volunteered work time at the Northeast Food Co-op in Minneapolis. Since then, he has volunteered, been employed, and managed several food co-ops, including Bryant Central Co-op, Powder Home Co-op, Seward Co-op, Seward will correct me, and the Wedge in Minneapolis, and the Good Earth Co-op in St. Cloud, Minnesota. That's so many co-ops, Stuart. He helped open the Just Food Co-op in Northfield, Minnesota, as their first general manager. His experience also includes time as a food buyer for the co-op-owned Dan's Warehouse and service on several co-op boards, including the Twin Cities Natural Food Grocers Association and Cooperation Works. Stuart began providing startup co-op support as the first staff person for Food Co-op 500, a pilot project organized by visionary co-op leaders in 2005. The project incorporated in 2010 as Food Co-op Initiative, where he continues to serve as the executive director. Over the years, he has presented training at national and regional food conferences, developing webinars and written guides to provide communities with the information and encouragement they need to successfully start new co-ops across the US. Let's all give a virtual welcome to this incredible mix of panelists. Thank you all so much for joining. And we're going to start off with a shared question for all of you. So please, and let's do it. I'm going to stop share, but we'll go in the order that y'all are listed here. Sarah, Roberto, Stuart, Summer. Tell us a little bit more that's not in your bio. So tell us about your current work in local food systems, sort of where you're at briefly, and share an example of when you realized that things within your sector were never going to be the same. So let's start with Sarah.
Excellent. Thank you, Lillian. So as you shared, I am currently a consultant with SIFT Consulting LLC. We work with a wide variety of nonprofits on a lot of different projects, both big and small, to strengthen and build our local food system. And I also am very newly a network engagement manager for the Artisan Grain Collaborative, like I started 2 days ago. So I Don't have a lot to say about that yet, but I will be working to build and strengthen the grain value chain here in the upper Midwest. But so during the first year plus of the pandemic, I was the manager at the Dane County Farmers Market, which is the largest producer-only market in the United States. And when kind of one of the big aha moments that came to me very early on in the pandemic, well, to set the stage, maybe just a little bit. So the DCFM has about 260 plus members, and we host markets year round. Our flagship market is a huge outdoor farmers market around the Capitol Square in Madison, Wisconsin. And on a typical Saturday, it will welcome between 10 and 20,000 customers. So it's a really big event. And when the pandemic first hit, we were still in our indoor market season, our winter season. But the winter market is also very crowded, like you can sneeze and like hit 10 people kind of crowded. So we proactively canceled one market, March 14th, 2020. And then we immediately began to pilot a pre-order drive-through pickup market. And there was some customer interest, but we needed like better systems and a better space. So we worked with the county to secure a large outdoor space at the arena in downtown Madison. We partnered with an online ordering platform, and we were kind of just doing everything very, very quickly. When we first launched our first like official pre-order drive-through, we actually had to close our online store down early because there was like so much customer interest. And then that first night that we had the pickup, it was a mess. So we had like two of the main thoroughfares in Madison were like completely blocked down with traffic. It was like impacting the belt line that was around the city. The like county sheriff's department was there. The cops were there directing traffic. Like it was absolute chaos because there was so many people interested in getting their groceries from our farmers. And while that was not one of my proudest moments, it was definitely this like aha moment that the silver lining, or one of maybe the silver linings to the pandemic, is that like this is an opportunity for our local and regional food system to really like step up to the plate and show, you know, that the farmers market isn't just a big event on Saturdays, that we can actually be your source for groceries, and not just like the very sexy like seasonal fruits and vegetables that we all talk about being associated with fruits or with farmers markets, those, but also like your meats and your grains and your cheese and your like staple groceries that weren't on the shelves, or customers didn't feel safe going to the, you know, grocery stores to shop. But we could really be the source. And so, I mean, we quickly improved our systems, and we did not create like backups of traffic all across our city twice a week when we had our pickups. But I think that like that night when I got home, after maybe I cried a little bit because it was all such a mess, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is our time that we can show that we can actually feed our community. And then the kind of simultaneous aha thing was like, and like, we need to develop the infrastructure, the like kind of mid-level infrastructure, the distribution, the aggregation, like in order for us to do that. And I think that's something I'm sure we'll talk about more today, but that was definitely my moment.
Thank you, Sarah. What a story. Roberto.
Thank you, Lillian. First, I want to say thank you to CSU, Wallace Center, and USDA MS for helping to coordinate this incredible list of panelists and conversations. It's an important time, and there's no better moment than now to have these kinds of conversations. I would say, you know, the only thing to add to my intro is that, you know, my story is one of survival and persistence and resilience. and continuous learning, innovation, but that's grounded within a very specific set of values that are very central to our mission, our work, and even the internal relationships here with my team. We started farming or started our farm, Emerald Gardens, in 2017 and had good success engaging with farmers market customers, getting our first restaurants, and also supplying local food focused grocery stores here in the Denver metro and Boulder area. And everything was pretty tricky, starting up the farm, getting all the resources, accessing funding. You know, as a person of color in Colorado, to start a farm is extremely difficult. But one of the, I guess, elements that really helped our success was that, you know, I had a co-founder that I met in high school, and he really kind of focused on the infrastructure at the farm, all of the operations and workflows and resources that we could bring into the farm, while I started to focus more on the partnerships, community engagement, building social relationships, and at the same time learning kind of the steep learning curve, I guess, for how to develop our presentation and our marketing and our communications. And we were really struggling at the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, due to the closure and bankruptcy of one of our major grocery store partners. Because we wanted to honor the relationship, we didn't go after them for past due invoices, which were upwards of around $10,000. And that was a huge, huge struggle to ensure that we could continue to operate moving into 2020. And then about a month later, we lost all of our restaurants due to the shutdown. So we were kind of at a standstill, in a moment of limbo, not knowing whether or not we were going to maintain our farm and what was happening. Amidst the chaos, we knew we needed to do something, and we weren't going to allow the farm to just slip out of our fingertips with all the blood, sweat, and tears that we put into it. Thankfully, I had been doing relationship building and connections with food access organizations, food pantries, food banks, and nonprofits. And when they started to receive federal funding, they came to us because we were the only ones that had a year-round production and supply of leafy greens, microgreens, and herbs. And so that really allowed us to see a potential to pivot to not only meet the immediate need in the increase in food insecurity, but also leverage our local partners through local procurement initiatives, and gradually started to understand the role that we now were in charge with in terms of bringing in people from our farm network so that we could provide a better value and a diversity of food to the people that needed it the most. And that turned our farm around. So it saved our farm, and it also enabled the viability of other farmers in our network. The beautiful thing that arose from that was that this was something that should have been in place from the very beginning, that communities connecting with their farmers is literally the cornerstone of resilience. And that social relationship piece is so important so that we know and trust and have like a level of reliability for our farmers. And so that literally was the genesis of our new organization, East Denver Food Hub, which is essentially a social enterprise focused on connecting farmers to markets in the community via aggregation, distribution, and marketing services. But again, grounded in a very specific set of values. Those values are economic justice, environmental stewardship, agricultural worker dignity, and animal welfare. And we see this as an example of what we hope to see transformed in our food system. We need a complete revolution of the values that underpin the food economy. And for us, it's important to designate intentionally the value chain coordination of supply chain management so that we're able to imbue the food system with those values. And as we were looking at our future development, we realized that we don't want to build a business off of food insecurity. We want to end it. So addressing that immediate need allowed us to rapid prototype and to understand the mechanics of aggregating and distributing food as we begin a long-term plan to leverage purchasing power from our local institutions, hospitals, schools, et cetera, to be major players in developing equitable food systems. And for the first time, we noticed that food access organizations actually became a viable market, and one that is continuing to grow. But again, shifting the paradigm of food access and the rhetoric and the framework around that has been a challenge, because as long as we don't understand the whole supply chain from seed to plate and the gaps, inconsistencies, and inequities throughout that whole network, we're never going to be able to actually address food access and equity completely. So that has brought a level of awareness, a historical context for our food access partners, basically grounding that history of agriculture within an understanding of stolen land and forced labor. And that is the lens that we bring to everything that we do. And it actually is building solidarity because we understand the context and our role as food providers much more clearly and critically. So that has brought us to a very important position in terms of the food system here in Colorado to basically guide the conversations that are informed by our daily experiences on the ground and at the table, to hopefully bring about an intersectional awareness, multi-stakeholder connections and conversations, and mount a collective movement or a coalition to coordinate all of our efforts toward the common good and toward a common vision of an equitable food system.
Thanks, Roberto. Stuart, so what's your role now, and what was the moment that you knew things would never be the same?
Yeah, and I also echo the thanks for being invited. I really appreciate this discussion. On the slide where you had my name, it's really interesting. I have two names that have to be spelled. Stuart can be spelled more than one way. Reed can be spelled more than one way, but almost never do people drop the D at the end. So
That's just my beautiful typo. Apologies.
Oh, I love it. I love typos. They're fun. Anyway, yeah, I am director of Food Co-op Initiative. We're a national nonprofit co-op development organization. USDA provides a significant part of our funding. We are in existence for the main purpose, almost you could say sole purpose, of helping communities start new food co-ops, and specifically retail storefronts. We do help co-ops that may start out with an online market or some form of limited access retail space, but that's basically what most of them are. Right now, we're working with probably close to 90 groups across the country that are at some stage of wanting to open their own store. And we get as many as 2 or 3 inquiries a week right now. It's been very significant uptick, I would say, in the last year. And I don't know how much of that's COVID related. I think some of it is. I think there's a lot of political reasons as well, but there's a lot of interest right now in food co-ops, and it's a great timing because they really are community-based organizations that can enable a lot of the things that the previous 2 panelists talked about. They connect the consumer to the farmer. They connect the health needs of the community to the people that can help through food or through education and outreach. So co-ops have really shown during COVID, and even the startups, the ones that aren't open yet, have found ways to do that. And I'm very, very excited by what they have done. The moment for me, the first moment, there's pretty much a 2-stage thing, but the first moment was we just happened to be planning our big annual conference right as the first COVID outbreak was starting to become serious enough that people were just trying to decide, what they should do about traveling, masking, and everything else. And we went ahead and held it. We had about over 300 people from startup co-ops around the country. And as far as we know, nobody transmitted any COVID at that event. And that was pretty much the last national event that the co-ops did that year. And since, for that matter, there's starting to be a few now. We're going to try to do a live event again this coming May. So cross your fingers for us. But that was the first. I mean, we agonized over whether we could do that live or not. And we made the right choice, but only barely. After that, we started hearing, when things did start locking down and slowing down in the economy, a lot of our startups were calling and saying, well, how do we do this? Do we just kind of shut down until it's over because we can't have community meetings? How do we go about organizing in this environment? It doesn't make sense. So we did a series of live webinars with people that had figured out some answers, with experts from the local co-ops themselves, did case study presentations to try to get people inspired in ways that they could move forward. And the results were dramatic. We had startup co-ops that organized with their community support, with their civic support. They were contracted to provide food to people that were food insecure in their communities, distributing hundreds of boxes of food at low or no cost through volunteers of their co-op. We had co-ops that set up calling trees so that they could check in with their members, make sure they were all right, find out if they needed anything. The mature co-ops were some of the first grocery stores in the country to establish strong requirements and safety protocols for COVID, well ahead of the supermarkets. And as a result, they retained and gained loyalty from their customers. They also had better stock on the shelves because their inventory came from a distribution chain that was not centralized like mass market stores. They were able to continue buying from local producers. 20% to 25% of the sales in a typical retail food co-op come from local producers. And that definition of local is a lot smaller than what some of the big markets use. So they're working with people they know. They're also working with local farmers who, like Roberto, may have had contracts or expectations to sell through food service outlets, through restaurants and contracts like that, that had extra product. And co-ops were able to buy a lot of that product and move it. Sometimes it was, if there was a great surplus, it may have been discounted, but the farmer producer got something and got exposure, and the co-op got public reaction. And in the startups doing this, they really built their reputation. They got a lot of positive publicity. We saw dramatic growth of ownership in these co-ops during COVID. We've even had a couple open during COVID now. And so it has not stopped us. And I think that it's just continued to emphasize the role that community-based organizations whose priority is the health and well-being of all of the stakeholders in the community, from customers to the employees to the suppliers. It makes such a difference, and it's such a different economic model for our times that, I'll never say thank you, COVID, but it definitely gave us an opportunity to showcase just how important cooperatives are. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Stuart. That's so wonderful. Summer, we're so delighted, but also envious that you're joining us from the Virgin Islands. And I was trying to come up with what a Virgin Islands equivalent of, it's not your first rodeo. I was like, I don't know if there are rodeos.
No rodeos, plenty of horses, which is a very interesting dynamic. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start off by saying, so I live and work in the lands that are historically and indigenously Carib, Arawakan speaking Kalinago people. I live in the Caribbean, US Virgin Islands. I'd also like to acknowledge what I call the secondary indigenous in my area, because my ancestors came from West Africa, right? And have been here over 400 years. And by the time they got here, the indigenous people were wiped out. So just acknowledging that, because I stand on their shoulders. And so I am Summer Sibley Brown, founder and executive director of Virgin Islands Good Food. You heard that. And something you may not, that may not be present in my introduction, is I spend a lot of time talking to people who are not from the US Virgin Islands, right? It's not necessarily policy work because, as you may or may not know, we are an unincorporated territory. And so we really don't have representation in US Congress, right? We have a delegate who does a really great job of advocating for us, but Roberto said his is a story of survival. And I was like, well, mine must be a story of an invisibility, right? My work is working to make this very small territory and unincorporated territories and their food system challenges visible. So while I do work here, I spend a lot of time just getting to know people who live across the contiguous United States and learning from them and sharing with them what our challenges are. Interestingly enough, as you guys all shared what your moment or your point was, mine's is quite different. It was just kind of like, oh, more of the same, right? I spoke to an anthropologist a few years back who said the disaster or the climatic event is not the disaster, but often the disaster starts way before the event, and that climatic event just highlights, right, the places, the insecurities in a community. So we have been living since Irma Maria with a very, 2017, very visible presence of what doesn't work in a food system. And we import 98% of our food. I'm 43 years old. We have always imported 98% of our food. So I live in a very food insecure place. And we are at the end of a food chain because all of our food comes to us by ship. So this broken supply chain that other places were realizing and innovating around has been my reality for 43 years. So I was kind of like, oh, the rest of the world has joined us. Maybe now we can have some commonality in a conversation. And then as Roberto highlighted, like, what is the distribution management? So we don't have functioning co-ops in the Virgin Islands. We don't have aggregation centers. We don't have food hubs, right? So it's like, and we also don't have 10,000 people to go to a farmer's market on Saturday. So the differences are stark. And I guess what I would offer, or I feel like I can add to this conversation, is that scale matters. What I learned, or what the aha moment for me was, when all the USDA federal programs to assist farmers and assist producers came out, none of those opportunities were written at the scale of a small or large farmer in the Virgin Islands could apply for or matched our need. So I imagine there are inner city communities and rural areas with farms the same size and that can mirror the structures of our small farmers that didn't get the benefit of that. So I think in this process, I think our response to the disruption, while has been meaningful and helpful for many, and so I'm like, yes, I'm glad to hear that there are places thriving. My question is always, and who are the invisible, right? Because resilient food systems is predicated on readiness. If you bring help to a community that doesn't have the mechanisms to take advantage of it, is that really helpful? And so that's been the case for the Virgin Islands, right? A lot of the interventions aren't helpful because my community prior to the disaster did not have the readiness to be able to pivot. And I guess I'll end there and hopefully we get to talk a lot more. Thank you guys.
Wonderful. So as y'all watching can see, like, we are really it's such a gift to have these amazing leaders speaking from their direct community experience, joining us at this national platform to share, because we find that in that specificity of their experiences, there's great learning that comes to us sort of at that meta level. And so the next sort of theme that we're going to explore today is exactly what Summer was touching on, what all of our panelists have touched on, is like, what then do we carry forward? So we had these experiences, we had these aha moments. How does that shape our work moving forward? And these sort of critical understandings of resilience. And I love that frame of readiness. I'm gonna attribute that to you moving forward, Summer. I love that. So, and let's go back to that question of how, because I think something that's lingering for a lot of us is like, sure, there was this boom in interest in some areas. We've seen the boom in interest in co-ops. We've seen the boom in a continued infusion of cash into the emergency food security space. And Sarah, we'll start with you. For direct-to-consumer markets in particular, we heard CSAs are sold out. Oh, we're overwhelmed by this. How much has that persisted? What were the true successes of that boom in direct-to-consumer sales? And what impacts and considerations for farmers or consumers deserve more attention? Like what's the inside baseball of how that's all played out?
So I think some of the real like true successes were something Roberto touched on earlier. It's like if there is those relationships were made, there's relationships that were not in place before, where folks do have an actual intimate connection to people that are producing their food, and they have a little bit more of an understanding as to some of the challenges that go into that. I think that one of the kind of huge impacts and considerations that folks are just now kind of grappling with is that everyone was in such a reactive mode that it was like, all the farmers markets launched online platforms and did these drive-throughs, and so many individual farmers and CSA farmers launched online platforms, started doing home delivery, like started working with other producers to do aggregation, and that helped meet needs. And in some levels, I feel like folks are like, it's like it was successful. But I think that a lot of it was done without any real consideration towards how much that actually cost, especially for the farmers that were all of a sudden just like, yeah, we can launch an online platform and I can deliver it onto your doorstep. Like there's huge costs and like associated with that. And I kind of think that's like a little bit more as to where we are right now, is that there is still a lot of consumer demand for local products. But we're having to kind of maybe take a little half step back and think about like, is this actually sustainable in the long run? And is this actually something that is improving the economic viability of my farm or of my farmer's market? Or is it, just me doing more work to kind of get the same amount of money and stay afloat?
And so in answering that question, does that inquiry need to happen on the individual farm level, like farm by farm, or are there other ways, or for other panelists, are there lessons that we can take from other sectors, or are there tools available to help folks make that decision? I personally, this is a terrible thing to say, I miss my mid-pandemic food system, because I was getting this gorgeous produce delivered to my door. I had all this time to like make meals. I wasn't running all over the place. So not to mourn mid-pandemic, but we liked it. There was something to be said for it. It's like, how do we make that decision and understand what investments would need to be made to make that feasible or viable for the folks involved?
I mean, I definitely would love to hear from other panelists. I think that I feel like it's a both and, that it needs to be done at an individual farm level. And we can also, especially folks, like myself who are in more support roles, I think that we can develop tools and provide resources to help farms understand the implications and how to grow in a sustainable way.
Yeah. So I was going to pitch it over you. Yeah, go somewhere.
So to add to what Sarah shared, I think what I'm hearing in that analysis is, right, like they're working on like an iterative cycle. It's not named that, but it's kind of part of like responding to the disruption. Like the producers immediately pivoted to meet the need to sustain, right, to survive. Now what they're in an analysis phase to make sure that pivot was beneficial. What I think producers could benefit from is training in this like in like that pivot, iterate, scale, right? So if there was a shorter response cycle, right? Like we were looking at this for 3 months instead of 2 years. In the first 3 months, if that data was collected and we're like, is this beneficial? What can we do to make sure it's more efficient, right? And they were applying changes along that pivot cycle, then they may have found a way to increase efficiency and lower cost. But now we're looking at a more longitudinal, it's like 2 years later because they were in the doing. So if there are places that could support them or training afforded to small farms for them to get in that thinking cycle, I think it would have been helpful because I feel like they were in the right steps. It's just now we're in analysis. Sooner analysis could have been more helpful.
I love that.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I
Roberta.
wanted to respond to Summer, something you said earlier in your add-on to your introduction, and that's, how do we make the invisible visible? And I can see that clearly in terms of, and I'll use a very simple kind of example. When you go to the grocery store, you just see a product and a price. You don't see all the labor, the injustice, perhaps, or the human experiences that contributed to that product. And I think, our former food system did a great job of making those things invisible to provide the convenience to the consumer. Well, COVID completely illuminated that. And so, now we're really, in addition to a process of analysis, is a process of understanding and demystifying food systems to really highlight how they work, to understand the power, the mechanisms of power, the resources, the capital, who makes those decisions, where they go. And we have to understand that those are part of a historical process that has been ongoing to manifest itself in these different challenges. And so when I think about, for example, the new normal, I can't help but think about normal was what got us here. The new normal is a revisiting of all of those processes to reinvent and to come up with a different language to talk about things. And that has to permeate also where capital and resources originate from and who holds access to those and who determines who has access to them. So in our redefinition of new normal, we also need a redefinition of capital for how that can actually function. And one of the things that I've been thinking about alongside my interest in agriculture, and specifically now what we're calling regenerative agriculture, and I put it in quotes because I think it misses a lot of the indigenous work in agriculture that built the foundation for what we now know as regenerative agriculture. Again, it's another erasure that we need to make visible. For me, there is this understanding that sequestering carbon in the soil heals the soil, right? And it addresses climate change. I think we need a similar thing with capital. We need to sequester capital and put it back into the communities so that it could heal our communities and fortify our local economies and really support the people on the ground in their efforts towards self-determination. Another interesting thing that is happening is that this understanding is also really emerging in our institutions and our organizations and our philanthropy sector. They want to have a more transformative impact with their funding. And I've seen this come again or come into our purview in different ways, but it allows us to really see, okay, if people have a commitment to equity and they have a commitment to community wealth building and well-being, then we need to actually have a toolkit, because for the longest time, we've never been able to actually implement those initiatives. And perhaps it has happened in different pockets, but now it's happening collaboratively at scale. And one of the things that I really like about, Summer, when you mentioned just the specificity of different contexts. And although they're all different, they are really connected due to some of these historical, economic, and global processes that really kind of privileges certain sectors over others, certain countries over others. And so there is this global analysis that we see and we feel on a local level. And I think now we're really at a moment where we get to see how everything works again. And what I'd like to kind of, see come through all of these different conversations that I've had with practitioners of distribution and aggregation is how do we build, and I'll use a term from our partner at Farm Fair, economies of collaboration that can hold their own in front of or in the midst of economies of scale. And so we need to regionalize, localize, connect, exchange ideas so that we have these clusters that are getting ever larger to finally connect on a national and perhaps even a global scale. that is attributed to these values that hold us together.
That's so
And
cool. I love that idea of economies of collaboration. And I wonder if Stuart might, this is feeling really parallel to cooperative economies. And I wonder if
Yeah.
you could share more about that. And also this idea, Roberto, what you said of like the space-based specificity, like this context. And Stuart, I remember in our pre-conversation, you mentioned that you're seeing interest from different types of urban and rural communities. And what do you see as the spark there? So like, how do you see cooperative economies aligning with what Roberto's describing as quality of collaboration? And what's the opportunity there? Where are we at?
Well, the opportunity is huge because it will make a big difference in the food system if we can create those kinds of communities. Um, right now, the need is driving the demand for new food co-ops, where they're needed the most because of food access issues usually. We're seeing, we've heard of the silver tsunami, we're seeing a lot of rural grocery stores, pardon me, closing when their owners retire and nobody wants to take over a business that at best is minimally profitable. That's the grocery world. And declining sales because of dollar stores or people willing to drive 40 miles to the nearest Walmart. So a lot of those communities want to keep their local store. It's a community hub. Grocery stores are, and especially in small communities, are a hub. They're social as well as business. And so we're getting calls from communities like that. We're getting calls also from the other side of the spectrum, where in urban high density communities, urban sometimes is a code word for communities of color. Well, in this case, I am talking about communities of color, but I want to be clear that that's what I mean. Often in larger cities that have been historically disenfranchised, redlined, abandoned by major markets, served only by what they call party stores or small bodegas, where you can get all the chips, cigarettes, and pop you want, but it might be hard to find decent fresh fruits and vegetables. So the confluence of COVID and the racial reckoning have really driven interest, especially among Black communities. And we have gotten a tremendous number of inquiries for the recognition that we need to take care of ourselves. We're not being taken care of, and other people, in spite of what they say, don't care. I mean, it's obvious in their actions, if not their words. So those have been areas where we've seen amazing changes in the number of inquiries versus historically food co-ops were seen as the province of progressive, well-educated, middle class, and frankly, white communities. It's changing a lot. So I want to address the infrastructure. I mean, you talk about a collaborative systems. We have food systems in some market areas where co-ops have been for a while. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul area is a great example where there's over 14 storefronts in one metropolitan area that are all cooperatives. They've been working together. They're one of those co-ops opened a warehouse, which is a cooperative warehouse that emphasizes local and regional products that they distribute through a multi-state regional area. So as a result of this, co-ops that have been around for over 40 years supporting farmers, we've got more small farmers succeeding in our area than in most parts of the country. So it builds on itself. We're known in the community. You go a lot of places and say co-op and they don't know, what are you talking about? There's similar right now in Chicago, which didn't have a food co-op a few years ago after the old wave co-op of Hyde Park closed. We have about 10 co-ops in that region working to open, and three that have opened. And we're looking at a food system developing in that market area really soon. And the food co-ops have their network of support through national organizations. Most of the larger co-ops are members of National Co-op Grocers, a services organization that provides support and better purchasing contracts. The co-ops are connected through the National Cooperative Business Association, and they work to do cross-sectoral improvements and build the awareness of co-ops across the United States. And we're all part of the International Cooperative Association. There's parts of the world where co-ops are 20% of the gross national product. Who knew, right? So yeah, we've got that structure, but the sad thing, the important thing is, no matter how well we're doing and how much good we can do, we are tiny in the world of the grocery industry. And we are still unknown and not understood by most people. So the fact that this is the USDA Ag Marketing that's sponsoring that, the marketing piece is what we have not done well. And we really have to tell people, not the people that know what we're doing, don't preach to the choir. We've got to get this word out that there's a better way to do food in this world. So thus endeth today's lesson. Amen.
Yes. So there was a question I wanted to be sure to get back to Summer. So for those of you attending, we have a little pre-meeting where we get to know each other a little bit, and then I think a lot. Finding other people interested in food systems resilience and like emergency preparedness, we tend to like get really excited. And that was my experience talking with someone like, oh my gosh, you also think about this? And so getting back to this idea of, and thank you, Stuart, for those comments of like the specificity of place really informing action. As you mentioned, Summer, your community has been hit by climate-induced disasters, historical, slow-moving but high impact impacts on your communities, colonialism, and then the pandemic. So I'm wondering, how are the disruptions of COVID different or similar from your previous experiences? And how has that shaped, how has all of that combined shaped your thinking about food systems resilience, just to spend some more space in that, inside of your beautiful brain?
So I think the first thing, I guess it would go back to visible and invisible, right? When you have a physical climatic disaster, or even a disaster that's man-made, because I want to highlight, it rained oil here this year, right? When a restart of a refinery, it rained oil twice on half of my island, which is where the farms are. So that's, you can look it up in the Washington Post, right? So even man-made disasters, there is a physical implication. When a hurricane, an earthquake, a tornado rolls through, what is disrupting your market is that you lose physical infrastructure, right? And so there's like this period of time. I think what is different is that now the people within the food system themselves, the farmers, the grocers, and even the consumers, they've lost their basics, right? People are trying to recuperate shelter. They're trying to find family members. And so they're embedded in this, their own personal resilience and safety. And so the farmer's market is knocked down and you can't really do anything until you build it back up, right? You can't get your leafy greens back in the greenhouse until the greenhouse is repaired, right? So there's this physical thing that has like a 90-day short timeline if we're talking about like disaster emergency, and then moving into the recovery phase that has all these inputs that need to come in, right? And the resilience and the recoup time is much different because it's a physical impact. And for some people, it's their homes and businesses, or for some people, nothing could happen at all, right? And disaster dollars or emergency dollars coming in are really critical for people to reclaim. In the Virgin Islands, we still have people who don't have roofs on their homes 3 years later. Our Department of Agriculture is still decimated, physically decimated 3 years later. And what COVID had, I want to say the word insidious, right? Because there is no, when you wake up in the morning, there is no feeling that there isn't a disaster, right? You're not immediately hit. The impacts of COVID, they creep until the moment that you go to the market and nobody's there, or that your governor says everybody's shut down, we can't go because the numbers are too high. All of a sudden, then you're in this like immediate thing, like, oh, what am I gonna do today? Because all of my lettuce is still growing. Like after a hurricane, all your lettuce is gone and you're trying to scramble to get your pigs back in their pens and find your cattle. COVID, everything outside is still eating, it's still nurturing. So there's also like this additional cost, and there's an increase in food waste, right? So like, I think the physical aspect of the difference in what disasters do is important, because I think COVID or the non-physical, they're hopefully easier to address if we were building a resilience timeline, there are things that we can do to address that disruption more quickly. And like things like this, like what are different places doing? Like if I could take, you know, Sarah's drive-through model and scale it to what something that could work here. Like, but with a hurricane, you actually never know which part of the island is going to get hit. You never know how it's going to impact them. And you never know how many days you'll be without power, right? And so I think those were the things that highlighted for me.
I'm really struck by this idea of creeping impact, and it's resonating with me that feels like that the pandemic was in some ways a reckoning about our interconnectivity. Like we were all thrown into it. So instead of being able to deny or make invisible the suffering of specific communities, you're not just making the pull here. It's like, oh wait, it's creeping. And over the course of 2 years, like, I don't know about y'all, but like, even now in 2022, I'm like, things are challenging. Like I have colleagues that are struggling, and Maria it still has lasting impact. Those wounds are not healed. And then we have Irma come through. And I know we've got a number of folks here on the call today from the Gulf Coast. And as those storms moved up through the north, Kentucky is routinely flooded. Now we routinely see our farmers having their fields washed out because of rains coming up from the Gulf. So there's a lot to process. Yeah.
People are fearful because hurricanes, snowstorms, tornadoes, whatever it is, your disaster, every region has something. And whatever it is, it's coming again. There's a season for fires. There's a season for flooding. There's a season for tornadoes. And then when you add on top of it, there's now this pandemic, which is a health disaster, which is causing an economic disaster. Oh, and I'm still preparing for hurricane season. That's 3 months out. There's this level of stress that people within the food system, specifically producers, are living. I mean, consumers have it too, but the people whose, you know, day to day, I need this to eat. You know, they're not a researcher. They don't get a check just because the transaction happens. And it's not just because there's a lot of work, but the transaction happens with the exchange of that food and their ability to produce it. And now this whole season can come and wipe me out. Plus, I already have these things. And if I go to the market, my wife could get sick because she doesn't believe in vaccinations, or we could be vaccinated and still get it. Like, these are the things that we have to now navigate. It's a justice issue. It's an environmental issue. And, you know, and anyway, yes, I'll let other people talk.
So, and part of what I'm loving here is that, that there's both a need for a real embedding and a knowledge of the place and the community you work in and the relationships there, but also as regionally specific disruptions happen, connections to folks outside the region who can bring product in or move product out, or resources or knowledge or support, that we need both. And if we think about the strengths of local and regional food systems, boy, that's us all over, right? And I think what I'm really appreciative about the support of USDA for this project is that we're trying to find new ways to build those networks and do so in a way that makes the invisible visible. And Sarah, I'm gonna, sort of this next phase of our conversation, thinking about the lessons we're carrying forward. We've heard a lot about relationships, and in our earlier conversation, you mentioned how the county, or I think it was the city. So for direct to consumer markets, what relationships were key in that process of adaptation? Were there new partnerships that you've continued to develop and maintain? Like, so what's the role of relationships? Where were some new and unexpected partners? And I think we say this a lot, like, oh, you need networks and relationship, but that's like telling my students, like, oh, you should go to a conference and network. Like, they look at me like I have 10 heads. Like, what does that mean? Like, I just walk around with business cards pinned to my shirt. Like, what is networking? How do we do that work? And what has been your experience?
Oh, that's like a big one, because I do feel like relationships, like, I could definitely like sing that from the rooftop. Like, relationships are what are getting our communities through the pandemic, and certainly what's getting our farmers through the pandemic. And I think that, you know, certainly we have specific relationships. We did make like really lean heavily on investing in a lot of our relationships with state and local government agencies, partly just because of how our permitting process and things like that work. But I also think we saw a need to, like, we're continuing to see, but we also need to continue to actually invest like time and energy into breaking down the different silos like between folks. It's like we in the local food world, you know, we love to talk to each other. The farmers markets talk to the CSAs, talk to, you know, the other folks. And when the pandemic first hit, and I mean, Roberta mentioned this too, it's like all of a sudden the emergency food system was like at the table, and they hadn't been at the table before. And I think, you know, as our schools were closed, or moved to virtual learning, and all of the challenges that had with making sure that like the kids were still getting fed, like brought farm to institution people, like all of a sudden we were having these very important cross-sectoral conversations. And I think that they have started to bear some fruit, at least, you know, here in Wisconsin. It sounds like both state and federal folks are like starting to listen to the fact that like we need meat processors and things like that. But I think that like that true like cross-sectoral conversation was just reactive. It was a result of that, like the world was shutting down. And I think that in this future, we need to figure out ways that those conversations are not having, like, they're not only reactive, like that they're happening all the time, and that our farmers and our local food system is part of this like larger, I don't know, system. And I hear that a little bit like when Stuart's talking about how like co-ops are such this like tiny part of like the grocery store world. And it's like, so how do we make it so that we're not just this like tiny like secondary part?
I see a lot of heads nodding, and y'all are also welcome to respond to each other. I was going to ask Roberta about this too, about the role of community food security, emergency food funding, and to everyone, we've shifted our next month's webinar to focus on the infusion of federal funds into this space. So we'll be diving deeper into it, but I know it's top of everyone's mind. What are some specific ways? So what does this look like in action through the Food Hub or through your partnerships with farmers? How do we implement it in action?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, Colorado has a lot of good things going in terms of programs and initiatives aimed at addressing food insecurity and the viability of local farms. For example, we have a grant right now called the Food Pantry Assistance Grant that basically allotted $5 million to food pantries to purchase food. And, you know, for me, that's like a huge amount of money that, you know, can have a dramatic impact in our local farming community. There's a lot of assumptions and misconceptions coming from food access that, for example, local food is too expensive. Another one would be that we don't have enough local food to feed everybody. And, you know, these are conversations that illuminate a lot of interesting dynamics. But ultimately, you know, I think the food access sector is becoming much more aware of the important role that they play in food system resilience and in community well-being and wealth building. What we've been able to demonstrate is that as a food hub, we're actually able to create opportunities via the purchases that we receive from food access organizations so that we can create jobs. We can think about other elements of the food system that may impact specific members of our community who bring that to our attention so that we can innovate other solutions. And, you know, it's gradually creating this hub to hub network, or Stuart, kind of to your idea of like this co-op of co-ops that is creating these networks, these web works that allow food to travel efficiently in a manner that meets the needs of every community. And so we're using this opportunity to collaborate with food access organizations to scale this new model. And when I first heard about federal funding coming in or federal relief funds, to me, they were much more in terms of, or I consider them almost like investment capital to jumpstart new operations, new enterprises, and to provide people the opportunity to launch new businesses. So I think the food access community has become a very important and strategic partner in the development, not only of our enterprise, but of understanding and proving the concept of a regenerative and circular local food ecosystem.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Summer, I was going to ask you back, I mean, I'm not that I'm doom and gloom, but I know you share my interest in this. So how does the inevitability of these disruptions, because I also just want to give you space to talk about the super cool programs that you're developing. Like how do you work from that space of like disruption is inevitable? How is that informing the programs you currently have on the ground and how you think about the future?
Okay, so for the rest of the team, I do love talking about this, and for me, I think one of the things that I was sharing is that so disruption is inevitable, and because I work a little bit in systems change, looking at you bringing in my whole systems lens and complexity, adaptability, like those types of thinking have afforded me to be in better change management about the program, right? So it's two things that I'm looking at. We're looking at how do we plan for disruptions? And so if you think about Google, you think about the military, if you think about any tech, any industry that's leading, right? There is a level of simulation, like thinking like, what could the most crazy thing that happened to us be, and prepare. There's a level of data collection and evaluation, right? Looking at what actually happened and then using that data, not just to fill in a grant report and quantify what your issues are, but really to drive learning. Like, what are we learning from the collection? And then there's this other piece of being in relationship with community, right? Figuring out what the values and priorities of those communities are. And that is the intersection where you begin to determine how we respond to disruptions, right? How we build trust in community that we can try something new together and it is okay for us to fail because we're not committed. Failure is learning. Like producers and people in the food system, we're working with a centuries old capitalist colonialist system that has existed that is resistant to change. It doesn't want to change. And it's really hard for us to figure out, because it's something so critical about as food, what can we do different for fear that we'll get it wrong? We're going to have to get some things wrong to figure out what resilience is. What we can be in together is quick learning cycles, great relationships that have grace and communication, and drive it forward together. There are things to be learned from the Virgin Islands. There are things to be learned from Colorado and North Carolina and Wisconsin that can transfer, but scale determines that. Right? I think what we try to do is we go from this really huge scale of this is the best practice and this is the answer. I hate to break it to the world. Best practice cannot address the disruption. Your mechanic is a best practitioner. He knows how to fix an engine. If your house is burning down, you won't call your mechanic. So why in the food system, when it is crashing and our supply chain is burning down, are we trying to get the mechanic in there to tell us, here's the best practice for fixing food systems? The best practice for addressing change and being responsive is where we need to focus. And we kind of need to push ourselves to be in that doomsday scenario, right? We kind of need to be like, what is the worst thing that could happen to us? Not to delve into fear, but really to lean into innovation. Really to be like, what is the most creative response that we could bring about that nobody would ever try? Like, what is a hyper local food system, right? Like, they've never thought of that. Like, what do we do if there's no USDA? Nobody wants to talk about that. All of this is anchored in USDA. I'm grateful for them. We could have a conversation about equity versus equality, but what if? Because all our what ifs are being challenged. And what COVID did teach us is that we can pivot on a dime and that we will all still be here. Stressed out, tired, not wanting to talk to each other on Zoom, but we made it and we did some really great things together. And we learned a lot.
I think we've got a lot of praise hands going up. You're just like,
Here. Yeah.
how does that resonate with you? I think the other piece I'm excited about here is this idea and building off of that of cooperative infrastructure. Is that a space that's gaining? Are there innovative examples we can look to there?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we do have for food co-ops, like I said, some national organizations that do provide support that help. While each store is locally owned and independent, some of the advantages of having a chain without having the disadvantages of blinders on, only do things one way, our way.
Yeah.
So that is one of the strongest benefits that I think we have, is that existing part of the infrastructure. I think what's growing is some regional collaborations. There's several that exist across the country that support beyond what the national organization can do. They concentrate on finding regional supply deals, for example. The Neighboring Food Co-op Association in New England is a great example. They've got about 30 stores, including startups. They're not just open co-ops. They're supporting the developing co-ops. And they have some limited purchasing programs, but they're all local artisan type products that they get a discount and they all promote together. They provide training and support for each other. So this is the kind of thing that we're doing in our world. We have some conferences, we have training events. There's a lot of that going on. And the National Co-op Business Association provides support in a much more general way, but still it's helpful in their outreach and engagement of people in the country that may not be food co-op knowledgeable. So yeah, I think there's room for even more collaboration. I think that we might see in the future more co-ops that are maybe merging or federating, just so that they can reduce their overhead costs and still provide the same kind of local services and engagement that they're known for. But we're in a tough market, and adaptation has been the rule all along. So yeah, I think we see some really interesting, innovative things coming out of our startups that are finding that opening a full-blown retail store at a cost of $3 to $5 million or more, is beyond what their community can do. So what can we do to provide food in our community? And we need to be able to support those kinds of efforts better. So that would be a future direction, I think, that we need to go. But
do you have so the last question I was going to pose to everyone, and I don't need to call you, I'll just let's chat. What are the questions we are not yet asking? What are the lessons that we have yet to learn? And how so for those communities that have been cut out of financial wealth, how do we support them in building their vision of a vibrant co-op or a community food system with the tools we have, or the tools we don't yet have?
Yeah, well, the tools we have that we're starting to see just in the last 2 years, there's been dramatic change in how co-ops are being financed. Especially co-ops in lower income communities are getting a far larger percentage of their funding through grants, donations that may come through a fiscal sponsor, since co-ops are not charitable organizations, they're for profit. The profits are distributed back to the users instead of investors.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be clear. but yeah, some of the opening co-ops that are trying to open are on their way to opening. North Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan are a couple of great examples. They're both opening relatively larger stores to serve a different market from, it's a more conventional product mix, but still a lot of healthy food. But they've been able to raise a significant percentage of their funding, their startup capital, from non-traditional sources, grants, community, local, foundation, whatever it might be. In the past, the co-op might raise 60 to 70% from its owner members, either through equity investments or loans that those members would make to the co-op. That's just not feasible in some communities. And so we're grateful that they are able to find this, and we're working to make that. That's going to be a major topic in our upcoming conference. How do you work with funders? How do you work with your community? How do you tell them what the economic and social impact of a co-op is in the community to justify that investment? So that's an area of change right there that is pretty significant and was absolutely essential for being able to open viable grocery stores in lower income communities.
That's so interesting, Roberto. That reminds me of what you were talking about, sequestering capital in communities, and what happens if we think of our food system in our community food security as a commons? And like, does that change the way we think about the nature of those investments?
Real quick,
Yeah.
I just want to point out that in some countries in the world, the cooperative system self-taxes to support the development of new co-ops. That's innovative.
Cool.
Yeah, I think this is really something I wanted to also connect in terms of what we're talking about here. We're really having a tough conversation, almost a paradigm shifting conversation. And that can cause some concern for people who haven't yet quite made that leap. But one of the things that goes along with this network is that even though it's us and perhaps a lot of local, specifically BIPOC activists that are trying to promote new models for our food economy, it's not just for BIPOC people, it is for everyone. Like the work that we're doing is a commons, is to ensure and protect that for everyone. And we want these economic opportunities to be as diverse as the communities that they serve. I think that we really are interested in this interesting moment where it's almost like we're in a laboratory, like we're trying different things. And Summer, I really appreciated your comment because it is about rapid prototyping and action, but with a level of reflection and self-analysis. To be able to try different things, to showcase different partnerships and models, and to leverage the assets that are already here. Again, to this point of invisibility, a lot of these haven't been considered assets because they've been invisible, but people have been doing this work for a long time. And that's a testament to the resilience of specific communities. So leveraging what's already here and connecting that to people that want to have an impact and then create this cumulative collective effort, I think is going to be one way that we can move forward to showcase how this is beneficial on multiple levels and that there's nothing to be afraid about. There's nothing to be fearful of. This is where we want to go. And this is something that's going to support the longevity of agriculture and perhaps even buffer natural catastrophes if we begin to heal our environment, our soils, and our communities.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, the way that fear holds us back from change and innovation. Sarah or Summer, other closing thoughts? Like, what questions do we need to be asking? Things that you're taking away from this conversation?
I just think quickly, we are talking about paradigm shifts and talking about fear, and just to bring it a little bit also back to some of the things Summer talked about earlier with how incredibly stressful it can be to be a farmer in this environment. I just want to keep that on our radar too, to remember ways that we can all support our farmers' mental health. All of us are kind of hanging on a little bit by a thread right now. And change is really hard, but I feel like change is especially hard for a lot of farmers. So I just put that out there.
Thanks for that, Sarah.
Sarah, I'm really glad that you brought that up because, many of our farmers don't have health care, right? They don't have insurance policies. They don't have retirement plans. They don't have plans for sundowning. Like they're working till the end of the line. They don't have succession planning, right? And they don't have the resources or the mechanisms or the ease of engaging in that. And so as we consider what it means to have a resilient food system, both local and regional, we're talking about, we have to go to the micro processes in here, because what does it mean to be a resilient producer, right? What needs to be afforded to producers so they have personal resilience, because the link chains, right, are not just the co-ops on the grocers. What makes up the co-ops and the food hubs and the grocers are the people, right? Are the people in it. So I think that we're attacking many levels. And I thank you for picking that up and again, making visible that we actually have to have conversations about producer resilience and what they need, as well as us, the people then who are on a different level working to support those producers. What do we need to be able to be in this, to then do the work, the advocacy, and be in a well enough space to interact with change in a way that is not damaging to the person, because we're still people. And sometimes, you know, when we talk about systems and we talk about food systems in specific, it's product specific, it's region specific, but people, all of us and all of the producers that we support and all of the consumers who buy our food, and, you know, all of the people who get health and nutrients from what it is we're advocating for, they kind of somehow like disappear in that large, when you look at that large global food map, or when we're talking about food miles, there are people in there. So that's what I would end with.
What a pitch perfect. Thank you, Summer. I forgot to put myself on mute. I realized I was giving a lot of So for all of you attending, thank you for joining us. We're running a little short on time. I know there were some incredible resources shared in the chat. It was all going by so quickly. We've got a couple just next steps to share. If you liked this conversation, yes, I get to do this for my work, and I feel so dang lucky that this is like, that I get to be part of these conversations. Thank you to our panelists. I'm carrying forward so much learning from everything you shared today. This conversation continues in our next webinar. So if I can figure out Zoom again. Okay. So you'll see February, as I mentioned, we shifted our webinar. We're now making lemonade out of local lemons, innovative multi-sector strategies for leveraging emerging supply chain funds. So we've got a significant infusion from the current administration into emergency procurement of foods from historically marginalized producers and to vulnerable and marginalized communities. So how can we as local and regional food systems share our ideas of how to make the most of this opportunity, not as a flash in the pan, but as a way to invest in the long-term resilience, joy, vibrancy, health, well-being of our food systems and the people, as Summer mentioned, as a whole. So stay tuned for that on February 11th. And then March 11th, you'll see we're looking at data across the food system. For those of you, and Summer also spoke to this earlier, the importance of data in helping in our adaptation and learning. We're going to hear from our data metrics team, and then more to come after that. So you'll have to stay tuned. And we are also, is Sam here? Am I speaking on this? We also are hosting the Ag Outlook Forum. And if someone from the USDA team or my other team members wants to jump on and talk about this. Anyone? Just me? Just me. Okay, that's cool. Oh, Dawn. Yes, Dawn. Or not Dawn.
I will just say we've been really fortunate both last year and this year to have some of our project partners featured in a session at the National Ag Outlook Forum, which is great not only for us to continue these conversations, but it really helps raise the visibility of what's going on among pretty clever people to a wider set of the ag audience. So we highly encourage you guys. It's free registration. You can see the link at the bottom. And although it's a 2-day conference and you can attend all of it, we really want to highlight on Friday morning, they'll be featuring people from this project and talking about what we've been doing with this project. So we really would love to see all of you there. And so you really have 2 opportunities to connect with us next month. The webinar we'll be doing on the 14th and then or 11th, and then in addition, this webinar 2 weeks later. So go ahead and register now. We'll remind you again in February, but again, it's over my 2-decade career, it's exciting to see finally local and regional food systems showing up at that national conversation. So we hope to see some of you there.
Thank you, Dawn. And all of this, I did see questions in the chat like, is there a recording? You can visit our beautifully constructed, we're very proud of our website. Here's the dynamic there, or here's the address at the bottom. I'm sure one of my colleagues can drop it in the chat. Are the resources that we were given by our community of practice practitioners are in our resource hub. You can search it there by topic or by format. We have the case studies that came out of our project in 1.0 during the pandemic. We have sector snapshots. We have consumer insight briefs, cool data things. This is where the data platform will live, and where the webinar recordings and the written summaries are, both from last year. There's some really great conversations that happen. And as this new series launches, you'll find those there. So please join us there. You are now, if you opted in your registration, part of our mailing list. So you'll get updates at an appropriate frequency. So don't worry, we're not going to inundate you. And those will happen there. And otherwise, we are right on time. Let's give one more. Everyone come, put your videos on, say hi and wave. I know everyone's been so thoughtful, but let's just like see all the beautiful faces that have joined us for today. Yay! Thank you all so much. We're so grateful for the conversation and for the work that you're doing in your communities, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Oh, I didn't share, so not everybody saw everybody. Dang.